Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening. I want to first thank you for spending your day here waiting to testify. But I also want to say to you that I have a little trouble with part of what you testified to. And so in talking about black communities and white communities and this whole notion of what happens within communities, and then getting to your point about why certain communities may or may not respond how they respond to the death penalty, you talked about, when you referred to the black communities, you talked about but for certain circumstances, they understand their children would go because of their relation to the street life and drug life. I have a little bit of trouble with that because that's the only way that you characterized it. And I think there are very black communities and very white communities, and they're not all the same. And I hope you think a little bit about characterizing it that way in the future. I also have a little bit of trouble about what you called your primary evidence. And you said your primary evidence was the most primary evidence we were ever going to get, and it was that you spoke to some person named Joe without a last name. I don't know what state where this person is. If that's as primary as we're going to get, it doesn't really tell me much, because it's Joe. I can tell you a story about Bob if you would like, but I just don't know what to do with Joe, because Joe is really just some person. I'm not saying you're not telling the truth, but if you wrote a study and you told me there was a guy named Joe, I wouldn't really do much with Joe. I think you understand that. When you are talking about this the way that you're talking about it, and you're talking about if we get rid of the death penalty, all we'll have left is life without parole. And I think for you, the punishment cannot just be retributive, which is what you say life without parole is. So that's not enough. It has to be proportional, right, which is how you get to the death penalty. So I guess my first question to you is, if that's how you believe, what is your thinking about the fact that I asked Kevin Kane this morning, well, where are the majority of people who've committed capital felonies? The majority of them aren't on death row. And so are you telling me that what the chief state's attorney said was justice? Because I asked him about a very specific case. What he indicates to me as justice is not justice?
I'm not sure I understand that question, but first let me apologize for remember, I'm A, tired, and B, trying to race through this. In terms of race, A, of course I'm talking about Washington, D.C., principally Southeast, but not just Southeast. B, the real racial discrimination in the death penalty, which I never got to, which troubles me most, are the recent studies that show that, and this goes across the white and ironically the black community as well, is that defendants who look, quote, stereotypically black have a greater chance of being convicted and sentenced to longer prison sentences and get the death penalty. If that's true, and I believe it is, that is core racism, and that is a deep concern. Secondly, there's a correlation of race and class, and my view is that where the racial discrimination, the death penalty comes from, is the felony murder aggravator, which I'm against. I would see it abolished. I think it's the single most important thing to do with the death penalty, to refine and delete the felony murder aggravator, because felony murder, burglary and robbery especially, correlates heavily with class, which correlates somewhat with race. And my view is that it's unconscious racism that moves us to aggravate on the basis of robbery, when robbery should not be the aggravator. If it's especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel, that's the aggravator. If it's rape, it's torture, that's the aggravator. Robbery shouldn't be in and of itself. So I do have real concerns about race. If I misspoke or spoke too quickly, I didn't mean to stereotype and to suggest that black victims are necessarily all involved in the street game and the drug game, and I apologize for that, because it's a fair inference that you drew. It's what I said, what I appeared to say, and I don't mean it. What I meant is that there is, in my experience within D.C., ironically, a more nuanced view. That is, for example, in public opinion polls that asked, are you in favor of the death penalty? More African Americans wrote in what I think is the only morally correct answer. They refused yes and no, and they wrote in, it depends, which of course is exactly right. It depends. In the major polls that I saw, overwhelmingly more African Americans wrote it depends than did whites. to make that move is to show a nuanced understanding that it does depend, that we only reserve it for the worst of the worst of the worst. So I do apologize for comments that I spewed forth that may have been incomplete or suggestive, that I think that black victims only come out of the inner city and are only involved in the drug game, or I don't believe that. I know that not to be true, and I would be appalled if that was what I meant, and regret if that's what I said.
Again, to clarify the question I asked, though, I think we all talk about the death penalty in terms of the worst of the worst of the worst. My question comes from that. So I think the public kind of thinks of it that way. The worst of the worst of the worst are the people who go on death row, except that that's not necessarily true. The case that I pointed out this morning was about a man who took a young child who he couldn't get to stop wetting herself and crying and all of that, and bashed her head against a shower, and was up for the death penalty, and until the Supreme Court overturned this case for some things that had happened that had nothing to do necessarily with whether or not this was a death penalty case, but the way things had worked, we were going for a death penalty. The prosecutor decided that they weren't going to look for the death penalty, and decided that justice had been served. Many of the cases that are very terrible cases that would shock our conscience wind up with people with life without parole. And so my question to you was, it has been asserted to me that we have justice there. And you have asserted that you are about retributive justice, and it can't be met just by being retributive, because that's what life without parole is.
Yes.
It has to have this other proportional part to it. And so my question to you is, it's been asserted to me by the Chief State's Attorney that this is justice, and I'm asking you, are you telling me that from your point of view, that's not true?
Good. My claim is, it's when we ask how long, it's not just how long, it's not just duration, it's also intensity. That is, that the reality of punishment consists in something more than a number. It consists in an experience. So, while it is true that I'm a retributivist, and all true retributivists are about proportional punishment, and while it's true that I say that life without parole, which is a fundamentally retributive punishment, is not satisfying as presently administered, it's not satisfying because although it meets the criterion for the worst of the worst of the worst of duration, that is forever, it's not satisfying because it doesn't meet the criterion of intensity. If you change life without parole to permanent punitive segregation, punitive punishment, where it is self-consciously punishment, then it might, well, I may still favor the death penalty, but you will get many people who understand that the worst of the worst of the worst deserve punishment all day, every day, but don't want to trust the state's doing it with the death penalty because they fear mistake or other problems with it. So it's true. Now, if the other part of your question, if I understand it correctly, is how can I reconcile a retributive commitment with the fact that others who appear to deserve it aren't getting it, and only a few, is that part of the question too, that only a few who deserve it are getting it, and the vast majority of those who deserve it from a retributive point of view aren't getting it?
Right, so my question becomes, from your retributive perspective, is what we do right now in Connecticut with those who are life without parole, is that not justice?
It is not justice, given that you can be you can be outdoor wrecking, working, visiting, showering, and on a telephone 10 to 12 hours a day, every day. Although you raped and murdered a child, that is not justice, correct?
You talked about